welcoming everybody for attending our Sustainable Real Estate Development webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephanie Cronin. I'm the Executive Director of the Middlesex 3 Coalition. So thank you for coming today, and thank you to our moderator and our panel. And we'll meet everybody in just a few minutes. For those of you who for those of you who don't know us, the Middlesex 3 Coalition, we are a regional economic development organization which brings the public and the private sector together to improve economic development in this region. And we do that in a number of different ways. One is by creating connections, building relationships. And so we ask you, one way to try to do that via Zoom is just put your information, your contact information. If you'd like to connect with people, please put your contact information, your email, your LinkedIn information in our chat box, and we'll email this to everybody after. So hopefully after today's meeting, you can get together either virtually or we can get together for coffee. Burlington, Lowell, one of those places that we mentioned earlier. Just to let you know, we will be recording this event. And thank you to Morgan Walmsley from UTech for joining today's conversation. And Morgan, if you could put some information about UTech into the chat as well too, so for people who are joining us a little later, they'll have the information about UTech. And it really is a great organization. We want to try to be promoting the great work happening at our nonprofits as well too, and that's really been important for this region. Thank you to today's sponsors, AHP Architect, the BSC Group, and Reamer Bronstein. We wouldn't want to be doing these events without you. You guys are great. Speaking of great, we've got a great panel today. And so thank you to Demetrius Manius, President of Land and Sea Real Estate, for being our moderator, a trusty moderator. Thank you to Tony Bianco, the Director of Sales and Business Development for Actual Energy, Jeff Malloy, Senior Climate Adaptation Planner for the BSC Group, Steve Horan, Vice President of Leasing for Farley White, and Brian Krass, President of FMC Technologies. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining today's conversation. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Demetrius, in just a second. But before I lose control, I do want to let people know there will be time for questions around 12:45 or whenever we move people over, so it's a webinar just so that you guys everyone can enjoy their lunch while we're eavesdrop on this conversation. But we do want to try to make it interactive. So if people have questions, just type them in whenever you do. And hopefully we'll be able to get time to answer all the questions. But we'll be ending the meeting at 1 o'clock as well too. And we do also have a number of upcoming events. We'll certainly send you all information about some of our upcoming events. There's on autonomous vehicles. We have the utility companies coming to talk with our subcommittee, infrastructure subcommittee. The one I do want to highlight is what's happening in Burlington. There's a lot going on in Burlington. So Melissa Tatoklis from the town will be talking about what's going on in Burlington. Sean Williams, Chief Technology Officer at Costas Research Institute from Northeastern, will also be talking. And we need to update this because our national development, and they're also on this webinar too. They will be talking about what's going on at the district. I know we got a little sneak peek, and also the Burlington Chamber will also be there as well too. So there's a lot going on, but we'll save that for April 8th. And I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to hand it over to Demetrius and our panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Demetrius Spinaeus. I'm your moderator. I always want to say I am your host. Welcome to Fantasy Island, which is kind of what this is. But my name is Demetrius Spinaeus. I'm the president and co-owner, along with my wife Joanne, of Land and Sea Real Estate, based in Andover, boutique brokerage, deals primarily with development, commercial real estate, luxury residential. This is what I do, and particularly we have a large focus on the Middlesex 3 region. And Stephanie, as you know, years ago we started chatting about this webinar and what this webinar series might actually look like. And needless to say, with COVID, it's actually changed considerably. Those of you who have been part of our series this whole year, we've hit topics that we wouldn't normally have hit, such as, restaurants or, the change in retail, other types of issues. We wouldn't probably have been talking about it in a normal year context. Although I believe that sustainable development is something that we would have actually spoken about just because of the importance of it, and even more so, the COVID has shown the need for this even more so as people migrate out of some of the urban centers to more suburban centers. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our panelists, or have them introduce themselves. So I'm going to kind of go around. If gentlemen, just give me a few sentences on what you do, where you're at, and that would be fantastic. So I'm going to kind of go around, and on my screen, I'm going to start with Tony.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony Bianco. I am the, pardon me, Director of Sales and Business Development for Actual Energy. Actual Energy is a energy services provider focusing on managing and reducing electricity costs through a number of avenues. Not mainly focusing on energy supply, but other areas as well, efficiencies and things like that. And thank you for having me.
Brian.
All right, thanks, Demetrius and Stephanie, and hello, everybody. Yeah, Brian Crafts is my name. I work at FMC Technologies. We're located in Chelmsford, so right in the middle of the M3. And what we do is we help people save energy inside of their buildings. So we work on the demand side, helping people save energy, primarily in the HVAC and lighting aspects of their building costs.
Okay, excellent. Jeff.
Greetings, everyone. Jeff Malloy, BSC Group. Thanks to Middlesex 3 for inviting me to participate today. It's always a good time and fun and a good discussion. I'm the Climate Adaptation Services Lead at BSC Group. We are a land use development firm that does engineering and planning and ecological sciences services within the public, private, transportation, and energy sectors. We have offices, we're based out of Boston, but we have offices in Worcester and on the Cape and Glastonbury, Connecticut, and newly opened office in Manchester, New Hampshire. So we're expanding our footprint and working on some interesting projects, some of which I'll talk about today. So pleasure to see you all.
Very cool, very cool. Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Horn. I work for Farley White. They are a Boston-based landlord and developer. They own about 5 million square feet in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Florida. We've got 2 million square feet in the up and down the Route 3 corridor. And thank you, Steph, and both Stephs and Demetrius for having me.
Cool, fantastic, fantastic. And of course, Steve's been a guest before on our webinar, and so he actually said yes to coming back. So I guess it wasn't that much of a painful experience the first time. So thank you. Thank you. And again, thank you all for being here. So, we're talking today about sustainable development in real estate. And this has been a big catchphrase, I believe, in recent years, especially, probably the last decade, or definitely since the last economic crisis with the real estate crisis back in 2007, 2008. And this has been something that's been more of a growing interest amongst municipalities and amongst developers and amongst communities in general. So maybe for our participants, if we can kind of define what we mean by sustainable development in real estate. I mean, we hear it in other forms like sustainable development in other countries, social equity as well as economic or other types of sustainability. But how do we mean it for real estate in general? So I'm just going to pass it off to you guys and give me your thoughts on that. We want to jump in, Jeff?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So yeah, I guess generally, by the textbook definition of sustainability, we would think it's often referred to as the three-legged stool of sustainability, where you look at the economic, the environmental, and the social implications of any sort of development project, whatever it may be. So we're talking about real estate development here today. So I guess through that lens, you would think that Any hypothetical development project would want to meet those 3 goals in order to meet the current needs of whatever your development footprint or development goals are. And while meeting those current goals, you also want to avoid sacrificing the needs of future generations, right? So we don't want to use up all the resources today to the detriment of future generations. So that's a kind of a big picture viewpoint. I guess I'll turn it over to another panelist to put it more into the contextualization of real estate development.
Steve, I think you wanted to say something.
So I think I was going to say that Jeff had brought up a great definition on our earlier call, and he repeated it. But I certainly think in real estate, I am one of many real estate people who aren't that bright. And so we look at it through a very simplistic lens, I think, of sustainability. We equate with the ecological impact of whatever the development is. And I think even when you narrow the definition down to that, there's still a lot of ways to tackle that issue, both on a micro level of, an individual tenant's footprint and how they might operate inside a larger multi-tenant campus. And then you can go on a more macro level, which would be either ground up development or city planning or some larger scale project, where I think that begins to bleed into what Jeff was talking about with a 3-legged stool. And it's no longer just about the ecological impact, but it is about setting yourself up for success as well as success tomorrow in many factors.
I think, Demetrius, from our standpoint too, we're maybe even more drilled down than Steve is, where we focus on the energy side of it really strictly, and how energy pertains to, saving energy pertains to being able to bring more energy in a sustainable way, more renewables and things like that versus the fossil fuel. So saving energy inside of a building once it's developed helps not only save the customer money, but it helps us macro level reduce the amount of, the old fossil fuel energy plants that are running. So we're probably more drilled down than even Steve is, but that's kind of our piece of it.
Cool. Tony, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just like to say, I'll add to what Brian said, is I guess, our firm, we like to say that we want to assist in helping our clients be good corporate citizens. And with that, we want to look at all areas of efficiency. Are there opportunities for new renewables, carbon offset, anything to do with reducing your overall carbon footprint is something we want to discuss with our clients.
That's great. So then tell me, if we're talking about, I want to talk micro just for a moment, and we'll get back to macro. But so we have our big 3 goals. We said, environmental, economic, and social. So now let's drill it down to an actual development and say, so what goals does maybe a development need to have? We mentioned energy efficiency. We mentioned a couple of things. Can you give me some specifics of what might make something be defined as sustainable? And then, what I want to talk about eventually is some examples of this. And maybe you guys can start giving me from your own work some examples of sustainable development that you've worked on that you're producing right now. So
I'd say probably I'd be a good person to start with this discussion, because I often think about any kind of development project through from a feasibility perspective. And I don't use that term, but it's a term that most of us understand. And when I think about development through the lens of climate change, I'm thinking about vulnerability assessments, right? So, but a nice analogy is feasibility assessment. And I would argue that any development project, whether it be public sector, private sector, should be thinking about the effects of climate change right now. And we can touch on those goals of sustainability by doing that. And just generally the way a vulnerability assessment works is you begin by looking at climate hazards. Okay, so whether this be inland flooding from a river, or if you're on the coastline, it's the impacts from sea level rise and coastal storm surge. There's other impacts like urban heat island effect, which is large areas of pavement tend to make the area warmer than the surrounding region that may be vegetated. Other impacts could be high wind. I don't know if anyone's been noticing, but the wind is crazy lately, right? It's just, but the data on wind is actually less developed than these other sources of exposure, such as sea level rise. But so we take those impacts of climate and we apply a projection to them. You know, what's the development what's the time frame of your development? Is it an office building with a 30 to 50 year lifespan, or is it, you know, the bridges over the Cape Cod Canal, which have 120-year lifespan on them, right? So that shapes the way you think about climate impacts. You then have to look at the assets. It's called the sensitivity of the assets to the exposure that they're exposed to, right? So is the sensitivity of the asset catastrophic, or is it temporary, right? So if a building is flooded, are you temporarily out of service or are you permanently out of service? Is the transportation to and from that property out of service, access, emergency preparedness, all those factors. And then finally, what you do is you look at the adaptive capacity of that building. What is its resilience to those effects of climate change? Then when you put those three elements together, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, you can then have a sense of what your vulnerability looks like on your property. So that's always a great place to start, you know, when we're thinking about these changing weather impacts that we're seeing because of climate change.
So then let me just ask a follow-up question. Is it easier to refit or redevelop an existing building, or is it easier to start ground up with all these things in mind?
Well, so there is data that says, and I've seen the numbers have increased. So I don't know exactly why, but we used to see that for every $1 spent on resilience, you would see a $7 return on the property over the lifespan of the property, right? So there's more nuance to that, right? Because is it a 30-year project? Is it a 50-year project? But a decade ago, it was a $4 return on every $1 that you see. So, but maybe a decade later, we're seeing more climate impacts than we anticipated. So that's why we're at a $7 return on every $1 invested. But the idea is that because of climate change, we have to think about our impacts from the natural environment in a new way, in a way that we traditionally didn't do, right? If we're sizing stormwater on a property, we traditionally look at historical precipitation data, but that's not applicable anymore. We know these things are changing. So it's much more expensive to retrofit a stormwater system in the future than it is to do it at the front end. I guess that's my perspective. I think I saw some other hands of the panelists that might have a perspective.
Yeah, I don't know if Brian, you want to say something, because I was going to throw it to Steve from the developer part, but Brian, you can go ahead and start.
No, that's all right. No, that was interesting, Jeff, what you had to say about the $1, $7 type thing. I mean, again, in our field, you know, in the industry that I'm in, we're on the other end of it a little bit, we're trying to slow down climate change, right? So trying to make it so that vulnerability, which I know you have to look at, but we're trying to make it so that, you know, buildings are a little less vulnerable by saving energy, using more renewable sources and trying to help it on that end. We do a lot of retrofits and they're definitely more expensive. I would agree with that. And when you design something, even on our level inside the building, it's definitely a lot more expensive on a retrofit phase. But, you know, the beauty of it is on a retrofit, you can really see the results too. You can really see, you know, what you had before, what you have after, and you can really get a good feeling that you're doing something, carbon footprint, saving energy, all that. So, but it is more expensive, no question.
Steve, thank you. Steve, from the developer point of view, I mean, is it easier to retrofit or to build ground up in this type of situation?
So I think it always helps to have a level of foresight. So I think when you can come in and identify a piece of dirt and do a feasibility study or look at the vulnerabilities and then build the shell, design the systems, those dollars are going to be spent more wisely. But I think this is this is a complicated problem, which is why we don't have a solution yet, because if you just did strictly ground up development, you know, there would be a lot more empty buildings up and down Route 3 because a lot of buildings have already been built. And so I think then all of a sudden you dive into the question of, is that dollar spent that's going to get you $7 in return? You know, are you able to buy an asset for, instead of $1, are you able to acquire it for 40 cents? And, you know, what are the replacement costs for ground up construction? And really that is a long-winded answer to say everything is on a case-by-case basis. And you really have to look at how are you going to be able to generate a return for your company, for the investors. And I think what's so great and really what's happened over the last 5 years or so is that sustainability and, you know, these commitments to ESG and just a more conscious way of going about business has really been coming from the demand side. And so what that's doing is that is forcing people who provide these solutions, whether it's office space, industrial space, residential space, to provide either retrofits or ground up developments that are taking into account both today's problems and an awareness that problems are going to continue in the future. So, you know, I think Farley White they own about 500,000 square feet of mill office up in Lowell. And so we're talking about 30 or 50 year life cycles of products. It was what Jeff was mentioning. And the building I'm sitting in right now is 150 years old. And so, you know, and we're coming in now, we're working on putting some solar panels on some of the roofs of some of these facilities. So I think every single project is unique, but the overriding goal should be, how do we limit our environmental impact today while still solving for the needs of today and tomorrow?
Beautiful, thank you. Tony, I'm actually gonna ask you a question about this. Insofar as delivery goes, I mean, does it make any difference to you whether it's a new development or a retrofit insofar as that? And does it actually matter location? So, I mean, so we're talking, you just mentioned, Steve, up and down the Route 3 corridor. Is it easier or more difficult if we're dealing with more of like, we're putting something in an industrial area outside of a city off of highway, or something of more of an urban location? And what kind of different challenges are there insofar as, you know, delivery? So let's say doing something in downtown Lowell as opposed to doing something in Billerica, for example.
Well, as far as my firm is concerned, it really doesn't matter to us where the location is, as long as they are in a deregulated area. So,
What do you mean by that, regulated?
So there are certain utilities in Massachusetts. It's National Grid and Eversource, and there are some municipalities sprinkled throughout the state. So you have locally, you have Concord Municipal, you have Wilmington, you have Reading. So in terms of deregulated supply, we can't really, as we do, we can't really assist any of those organizations that reside in those municipal utilities. But as far as back into the investor-owned utilities like Eversource, National Grid, there are many incentives to do energy efficiency projects and things like that. So I guess to answer your question, it really depends on where they are, what stage of the building they're in, if they're moving into it. We like to get with our clients beforehand to help manage their costs as they grow into the building, if you will, and then be able to manage it and look at some metrics on it going forward and how we can manage those costs and reduce them going forward.
Thank you. And
The
so,
utilities are really great, you know, Demetrius, about incentives, as Tony alluded to. Eversource and National Grid and even up in New Hampshire, but the municipals, as Tony said, Concords and Readings, they don't participate as well in the incentives as well. So it's a little harder to to get them to incentivize some energy efficiency projects, but they're starting to, but it's still
Yeah.
way behind the big brothers, I guess, the National Grids and Eversources out there.
So then let me throw this question out then. We're kind of talking around this topic. Tell me some of the challenges involved, because again, it's another one of those catchphrases. Everybody wants a sustainable development, but what challenges do we have in communities? What are municipalities looking at for challenges? What are developers looking at for challenges? What are the challenges involved in this? And I'm just kind of throw this out to whoever wants to jump on that.
Anyone?
I think one of the big ones is there certainly is a cost associated with
Yeah.
this. And there's a cost associated with any project. But just as an example, Farley White recently completed construction of a cross-laminated timber building outside Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So it's 3 stories, it's about 80,000 square feet, and the entire building is wood instead of concrete or brick. And so the building is carbon neutral. It is a really cool building with almost kind of a mill or ski lodge feel, but it has the dimensions of a modern office building. And then the systems inside the building, it has a variable refrigerant HVAC system, which I've had explained to me a dozen times, and I still don't really get it, but I think it is a very intelligent HVAC system that's wildly efficient. The lighting systems are efficient. So all of this is right off of a brochure for sustainability. The problem is that broad strokes, compared to conventional construction, you're looking at a price point that's between 20 to 25% higher than conventional construction. And so to dive into this, I think you have to either identify a market or a location where you feel confident building something like this on spec with no tenant in mind, feeling that you're going to be able to land somebody to come in, recoup those costs, and then generate a return over the term. Or you have to identify a prospect who's going to be willing to come in and pay something that is 20 to 25% above the market lease rates in the area. And, right now, over the past year, the real estate market has had a lot of questions. And I think one of the big ones is, what is it going to look like in the future? So what a lot of the customers, a lot of the consumers have done is they've looked for flexibility. And so they are looking for lease terms that are shorter. They're looking for blocks of space that are smaller and tighter. And all of that on the development side, it makes developers nervous. It makes the banks who loan the developers money nervous. It makes the principals nervous. And so to go out and swing for the fences like this is, ambitious would be an understatement. But that isn't to say this is forever. I think we are optimistic that a trend back to the workplace is going to continue. We've already seen it start to pick up. And then as that happens and as these dominoes start to fall, groups will again pick up the torch and commitment to sustainability when they're finding their next vision for their office footprint.
Wow. No, thank you.
Steve,
So
do
I
you
guess-
think that, can I ask a question of Steve? I was just wondering, that 20-25%, do you think that cost is going to come down in the future, as building codes become more strict about energy efficiency and LED lights and things like that? Do you see that coming down anytime in the near future?
So I think we do. And, I think you guys all understand that when you're on a construction project, it's all these little costs that just sneak up on you. And all of a sudden you're looking at the final number and you said, where'd that come from? But there were costs driving this, like all the lumber had to come from Canada because it had to be of a certain caliber. And so for a project like this, it took hold in residential projects in Europe. And now we're seeing the developer Hines has done one out in Minneapolis. They've done one in Atlanta. They're working on one in Toronto. There's one that's been permanent in Boston's downtown crossing. And so I think for this particular type of project, once proof of concept takes hold, I think people will realize that the materials to supply these, there's an opportunity there. As more suppliers get involved, I think the cost will be driven down.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in too, just to make sure we don't forget that there's three legs on the stool, right? So there's that social component, and the point Steve makes about added cost. In order for the development project to be profitable, there's a risk of issues like gentrification. And we see that, we see it everywhere, right? So it's really important to figure out a way, creative mechanisms to finance these projects so they can be profitable for the developer and it doesn't risk displacing people. There's in many locations there's a cultural element to where you live, right? And you don't want to diminish that embedded culture that exists within a community for the sake of renewable energy. Obviously, it's important, right? And sustainability is important, but we have to keep those three legs of the stool in perspective.
So let me ask you a quick question then. Do you tend to see these, and I guess I was trying to ask this before in a different way, are we seeing more of these sustainable developments happening in urban areas as opposed to suburban areas? Or does it matter?
Yeah, I don't think it matters. I mean, I think it's this type of development is going to be increasingly ubiquitous. And Brian, when we had this prep call, you had a really good point that resonated with me, that there's a demand. You're seeing a demand for this. People are increasingly aware of the impacts of society on the environment. And especially, I think you referred to the millennial generation, right? As really laser focused in on these issues.
I'm in trouble with all the millennials now, Jeff, that are watching. So.
They was right. But I mean, the point is it's at some point we need to figure out a way for it to be financially lucrative for the developer and socially just for the customer. Again, we don't want to displace people. I mean, I think in the urban environment, especially on coastlines, you mentioned this question started with barriers, and in urban areas that are subject to sea level rise and coastal storm surge inundation, there's a risk to municipal budgets from a loss of property taxes, right? So property taxes make up a huge percentage of a municipal budget. And there are chunks of land right on the coast that is very valuable that are going to be taken back by the ocean unless mega investments are put in place to protect this land. But we still see people developing on the coastline. So, maybe the barrier is a lack of really defined strategy at this point.
So let me ask this question then. Let's talk about incentives. Let's talk about financing. Let's talk about money behind this. And are there companies, or are there Massachusetts, since we're in Massachusetts, or municipalities? I mean, what do we have for incentives to do this? Because we all know it's very expensive. It's costly in manpower. It's costly in materials. It's costly on all these different levels, and we haven't really defined whether or not the sustainability gained from this actually balances out the costs in the long run. So tell me, how are these financed, and what other incentives, financial incentives, may they be for clean energy, or for equipment, or for developers, or any of these things?
I mean, I can start with that, Demetrius. Inside of a building, there's a lot of incentives by the utility companies. They're putting a lot of money at this because they're trying to get people to invest in energy efficiency, so it keeps their overall demand down. They don't have to build new plants. There's also some state financing. I know, like, there's somebody asked a question about that PACE program that I believe is now in Massachusetts. I think it started here last fall, and it provides some town by town financing that actually gets added to your I believe it just gets added to your mortgage or your taxes within the town, and you get paid it back through your tax bill. So there are a lot of individual programs. I don't know on the big development, like the overall size. Maybe Steve has some info on that as far as a big, a large scale development. What's out there?
Okay.
Individually, though, there's a lot of smaller programs that can help.
Right, right. Before I jump to Steve, Tony, look like you wanted to jump in on that.
I mean, I'll just echo what Brian said. I mean, there's plenty of incentives through the utilities, depending on what you want to do. That PACE program is just been instituted here in Massachusetts. It's definitely something that should be looked into if you qualify. I mean, I'm not one to pick anything, specifically, but if you are looking to institute an energy efficiency program, or looking at solar or energy or EV charging for that matter, there's plenty of incentives out there, and you just have to do your homework, and it's easy to find where those incentives are, because they come from a lot of different places.
So let me ask a follow-up question on that, and this is really for all of you. EV charging stations have become a big thing. One of the redevelopments we're doing in Lowell, we just added 12 EV parking spaces. I understand this is part of it. Has there been an increased demand, and is it becoming something? Do you think this is something that's going to become part of the metrics for towns, saying, okay, if you're going to do development, you need so many EV parking spaces?
I mean, I'll jump in first. The demand is increasing. Tenants are asking for these stations in the parking lot, so you're going to see more and more of it. There's a mandate from the government that we'll see. I mean, what's the percentage of EV of electric vehicles that we'll see in the next 5 years? I mean, the percentage is going up every year, and I don't think it's going to stop. So there's going to be a need for it, and right now there's incentives to put those in.
Right, because I know, for example, in office buildings, you're saying, okay, for every 600 square feet, you need so many parking spaces. I'm wondering if at some point that's going to be a defined metric. For every 600 square feet, you need one half of an EV space or something.
Yeah, and I hate to bring this up, but for the building owner, it could be another revenue stream. So that's the thing.
Steve's smiling over there.
Well, and I'll jump in real quick too. I mean, the EVs, there's no stopping it right now. So ultimately it's going to be a requirement. And basically at some point, every space is going to be an EV charging station. It's just the way it's going to be. I think one of the real interesting developments in automobile technology is autonomous vehicles or self-driving vehicles. And ultimately what I envision is going to happen is you're going to be dropped off at the front of your office building and your car is going to park itself. And so what that means is you no longer have to park cars, the requisite like 3.5 feet apart from each other, right? You only need to park a couple inches apart from each other. So think about how much space that actually diminishes in a parking lot that you need to accommodate the same number of vehicles. This means smaller parking garages. It's those types of, and it's going to change the way we even think about how cars park in the city as well, because ultimately I believe that we will see a situation where the cars will be able to identify where the cheapest parking location is, because it's parking itself anyway. Like I don't know enough about how to figure this out. I just envision the cars will park themselves, find the cheapest parking space, and then pick you up at the end of the day, right? So I think what parking looks like is going to be fundamentally different in a decade or two.
So, but also now, quick question, getting back to kind of the macro of this. How about, and I don't know if this is a question or a concern, but how about population density? insofar as one of these developments? I mean, is there also a metric perhaps where, you know, let's say you have a development of 140 units, and let's say that's of 1 bedrooms, and let's say suddenly those 140 units become 3 bedrooms. Does the sustainability, as far as the individual units go, and as far as the individual savings on this, is there a point where that kind of starts to balance off, where you don't, you know, suddenly it does not become cost efficient to be sustainable with population density? Is that even a thing? I'm just curious. Doesn't matter.
I think a
That's
full unit
those
is
guys'
certainly a better investment than an empty one. And, you know, to jump back to a couple of your earlier questions, though, and I think this loops in with the urban versus the suburban or rural, we are seeing instances of a commitment towards sustainability and all 3 legs of the stool throughout our portfolio. And so far, I use we loosely. My bosses own buildings in downtown Tampa. They own a tower in the financial district of Boston. They own some stuff in more rural New Hampshire. And I don't think we've sent a proposal out in the last 18 months that hasn't had EV parking as one of the subsections. You're seeing groups that are looking for solar panels to be added to the roof. And this comes back to the idea of, I think maybe 10 years ago, solar panels were a fool's investment because you couldn't recoup the cost. They weren't as efficient as they are today, and the cost to put them in was enormous. But we're seeing the cost drive down and the efficiency go up. And so I want to jump in earlier about the financing question, because I think the people lending the money in these instances, they're no longer looking at the sustainability projects as pet projects of bleeding hearts. They are looking at it as a real investment in the property. And to Jeff's point, an investment that you can measure and demonstrate a precedent for return. And so I think you might see it more in urban markets just because those are denser markets with higher rates, more people, so more money to play around with. But that is not to say that the suburban or more rural markets are being left behind. And then I think whether it's commercial or resi, I think you're usually trying to build a building that you can fill up quickly and maybe not to 100% completion, but have a strong chance that the population growth in the area is going to be able to support it. So you probably aren't going to be putting a large tower of residential out in rural Massachusetts. But I mean, maybe you're building pockets of residential, or you're trying to build a mixed use development somewhere where you think there's a real need for it.
Good. So let me ask one last question, and then I think Stephanie has some things. So we have a lot of municipalities on these calls. And so I'm going to throw one question out to all of you is, you know, is there a way that municipalities can make these easier? Or is this, or some types of partnership or something else to help this process? Or is there some ways that they're even standing in the way, perhaps, and they might not even know it?
I think most municipalities, the ones I saw on the list, are part of the Green Communities program, which really, you know, from our standpoint, really incentivizes them to do some energy efficiency measures. And certainly if they're not, I think that's worth looking into. It's Green Communities, run by the Department of Energy Resources, I believe.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and say that you know, most of the climate change vulnerability and resilience efforts are coming out of municipalities. In Massachusetts, the predominant grant funding program is the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, the MVP program. And all the Middlesex 3 communities have gone through that program, have received municipal designation through the MVP program. And then also, I took notes, there's 3 communities that have actually received what's called action grant funding to implement the strategies that they identified in their planning process. So, you know, M3 communities are actively engaged in this program, but I think the point is, Demetrius, you said you said partnerships potentially, right? Or collaborations. Lexington is involved in a large collaboration between all the municipalities that exist along the Mystic River within that watershed, and they're all working together, right? Because the hazards from climate change or natural weather hazards, they cross borders, right? So we need to be working together on these efforts. And I think there's an element of voluntary initiatives as well. And EMD Serrano in Billerica, BSC worked with them to on their landscaping plan throughout their campus, which is dedicated to bee pollinator habitat. So it's not your traditional like manicured lawns with lots of chemical applications, herbicides, pesticides. It's a naturalized environment. There's beehives on the campus, and they're creating ecological habitat. So what that's doing is driving down their costs of landscaping on the property, but it's also having a really important ecological effect. Just Google bee pollinator habitat EMD Serrano, and you'll see some cool videos about it on the web if interested.
Awesome. Anybody else? Any other ideas on that? Municipalities, how they can help, how they can partner, what they can do? Just curious. So before I turn over to Stephanie, do any of you have any final comment or any projects you want to share with us that kind of fall into this, or anything you're seeing coming up, or just kind of a final thought? You want to jump in and share whatever you'd like?
We've done a lot of projects in the M3 territory, Demetrius, and we were able to, again, we're looking at it kind of on a micro scale inside the building, but we're able to do with financing from the utility companies and other grants, we're able to get these projects down to, 12, 18, maybe 2-year paybacks. And that really helps because we see a lot of competition for energy efficiency with other projects that companies want to do. They want to spend money on production machines, things like that. So I really think the utilities do a great job helping out to drive these, getting these paybacks back to something that makes it look attractive when a company is considering them. So definitely having a good relationship with your utility rep can help execute those.
Oh, good. Thank you. Anyone else? Stephanie?
I did have another question, but Demetrius, I think we're in the similar mindset because you took my last question, and I always am interested in building partnerships, and especially when we do have municipalities on the line, it's good for them to hear what are the roadblocks, what do you like to see, what don't you like to see, and Brian, I think you bring up a great point with utilities. The same thing. We have a utility meeting later this month with bringing our utility companies together. And it's really just creating that communication and what do we want to see in order to be more successful in this region. So I'm gonna throw that out again, but I'll also throw out with that. I like it when we look outside the region as well too. And what are some of the best practices? What are some of the examples that you've seen that we should be copying to make our region stronger as well too? So I guess any of those, if anyone has thoughts. And Jeff, I see your mind working there.
Yeah, so we had our prep call, right? And you brought up the devastation in Texas from the recent storms, right? And I thought about that a bit after our call, and it's and then you just mentioned that the utility providers are going to be there's going to be a webinar coming up focused on that aspect, and we need to think about the interdependent nature of all these systems that we operate within. It's our energy, it's our transportation systems, it's our residential, commercial, industrial development, and they're all inherently related, right, with one another. And we can't solve these problems in silos. I know that kind of sounds like rhetorical or whatever, but it is very important that these collaborations are occurring. And so, I don't know, I just felt like that's an important point to make. And Steve also, sorry to keep referring back to our prep call, but Steve had a comment when we were closing, and he said that, private sector development should be, and has the capabilities and capacity to be leaders on this front. And I completely agree with that. There's innovation that can come out of the private sector that isn't going to be found in the public sector, but working together, there's the resources there that everyone can draw upon. So I think that's important. And in doing so, it will expand beyond the region, right? It's inevitable that will happen, that these solutions will be applied elsewhere. So I don't know if there's something motivational to come away with this discussion. I think maybe that is it, hopefully.
That was very motivational. It was great. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And the funny thing is, I do also agree with you that the innovation will come from the private sector, but the public sector can help quite a bit. That's what we've talked about. Fantastic. Thank you. That's great. That was great.
So I'll throw out one more question and see if anyone else wants to answer any of those. Is next steps. Should there be any next steps from this, or do we just keep talking and then let individual conversations happen? Or Steve, you're on my board. I'm going to throw it over to you since you've got some say in that.
I think having conversations and awareness, it sounds cliche because it gets said all the time and it's tough to demonstrate a tangible impact that has. But I think a lot of the progress that has happened over the last 5 years or so was born out of a widespread acceptance that these are real issues that we're capable of solving. And that was born out of just conversations and spreading awareness. So I think that is critical. And then secondly, I think any lease deal I get out of this phone call, I will make sure to have a seminar that talks about the sustainability of that transaction.
Rock on.
And we're going to have that at one of your places as well too, and you can cater it as well.
Right.
So with the risk of stepping on your toes, Demetrius, I'll see if Brian and Tony, you're the moderator, see if Brian and Tony want to add to that discussion in terms of next steps or what you like to see from our municipalities, our region, or other best practices.
I mean, I think that
I mean,
having the utility meeting will be great. That's something. I'm sorry, did I step on somebody there? The utility meeting is.
I'm not the
I
moderator.
think that's got to get out there. Utilities are really, particularly last year with with the pandemic. I know they'll probably tell you this. They're behind on their goals and on their 3-year plan. So I think there's definitely some opportunities there. I think some areas do outside, like looking at some of the urban areas, they have actually, like the BERDO, which is the reporting disclosure ordinance that actually requires, buildings over 50,000 square feet to report their energy, carbon footprint, energy use, things like that. Maybe that's something we don't have in M3, but, it's out in Boston, Cambridge. Maybe that's going to come this way at some point in time too. So I don't know. Next steps, there's a lot of them out there. There is a lot.
Tony?
I would just like to say, I mean, we said continue the conversation. I mean, depending on what types of projects you're looking at, there are many different options out there. And, this panel can certainly assist in directing you where you need to go. But, it all depends on the individual organization, what their goals are. And, some might just be to reduce the carbon footprint or reduce costs, but there's many different options out there. And I'll just echo what Brian said. I mean, now the utilities are kind of behind the 8 ball. They have money to spend. So it would make sense to get in contact with them for a start. Anyway, that's all I have to add to that.
Yeah.
Great. was going to say, there's some good information that Kelly Johnson from RDH Building put into the chat as well too. And if anyone has any additional information, please put into the chat. We're going to share all that with everybody who's attended as well. But I think that may be a great place to end this conversation. And Demetrius, unless you.
No, I think it's a great place. And gentlemen, thank you so much. This was a great discussion, great conversation. We touched upon a lot of important topics, and you know, I really appreciate your candor and your willingness to discuss and to be a part of this, and to, you know, my really hard, you know, Mike Wallace questions I threw at you. So I appreciate all of your time and being a part of this. So thank you.
And I'll end first by thanking everyone, Demetrius, Tony, Steve, Jeff, Brian. Thank you guys for your time and all your insights. I think you're right. I think this is a conversation we're going to continue to have. So we're going to be continuing to bring you guys into our conversation. So thank you for your time and your insights. Thank you to our sponsors, AHP Architects, the BSC Group, and Reamer Brownstein. Great group of companies. I look forward to seeing you guys all. We have a couple of upcoming events. Our utility meeting on, I think it's March 31st. If you guys are interested, give me a call, or just, it's on our website. And please register. And also what's happening in Burlington on April 8th. There's a lot going on in Burlington. So we're just going to continue the conversation, and hopefully we'll be able to get an in-person meeting at Farley White sometime in the near future. So again, thank you everyone, and have a great day. Enjoy the weather.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Guys.
Bye-bye.